I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
I'm here this morning with Judge Allyson Duncan of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I'm very much looking forward to talking with you about your background. And I'd love to start with having you tell us how you came to be a lawyer.
I decided that I was going to be a lawyer at a very young age. My mother taught in the law school at North Carolina Central University at a time when African Americans were really not welcome at Duke, which was to become my law school alma mater. And I grew up, I would go to the law school after school, and I would just crawl around the moot court room and try to lower myself in the book lift between floors, getting stuck once or twice, listening to the law students and just being enamored of them and their conversations and the things that they plan to do with their lives and what they could do with the knowledge they obtained. So I never really thought about being anything else.
You must have crossed paths with some icons of the bar.
Oh, it was wonderful. Maynard Jackson, who went on to become mayor of Atlanta, Mickey Mishaw, who is a figure in the North Carolina legislature. People like that who went on to do great things in the profession. And it was wonderful to have those as role models growing up.
Well, tell us a little bit about your mother's influence on you.
My mother was a remarkable woman for her time, and I occasionally wonder what she would be like, how much she would have accomplished had she been born later. She went to college. She actually went to Hampton, which was my alma mater, and then she obtained several master's degrees in library science because law school was discouraged for her, although she ultimately audited every course at North Carolina Central, but she taught legal research and writing. And so she used to actually edit my thank you notes. It was a very humbling experience, and I'm sure I resented it at the time, but have benefited from it since.
She must have inspired a great love of books in you.
A love of books and a love of words. She subscribed me to a Book of the Month Club, I think when I could barely read, but I remember reading about Amelia Earhart and John James Audubon and great American fighter pilots of World War II. And it opened my mind to what was possible. And given the constraints under which she lived, given that she was African American and a woman and handicapped, the fact that she never instilled in me any sense of limitation on what I could do is what I am most grateful for.
So tell us a little bit about your career after you became a lawyer. What did you do first?
I went to Rochester, New York, and was an associate editor at Lawyers Cooperative Legal Company, which I remember naively thinking would involve writing. And it does, but only in a very formulaic way. You probably remember the old ALRs.
Oh, yes.
Yes, so that was not quite what I thought it might be, nor was Rochester. So my father drove up to New York to pick me up, and we were driving home. And when we got to Pennsylvania, I made him stop the car so I could get out when we hit the Mason-Dixon line and say, "As God is my witness, I will never live in the North again." I have never seen snow drift over the tops of telephone poles, or lake effect snow for that matter.
So you must have found something else to do shortly
Quickly,
after that.
I clerked for a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, Julia Cooper Mack, who was the first African-American woman to serve on what is the equivalent of a state Supreme Court. And she was my hero, and I would still be clerking for her had she allowed that. But I learned a tremendous amount about being a lawyer and about writing and about being a professional from being around her.
And how long did you work for her?
She kicked me out after a year, and I did the next best thing to working for her, which was to follow in her footsteps. She had been Deputy General Counsel at the EEOC, and so I went to the appellate division at the EEOC, where a lot of her mentors worked, and I enjoyed that very much as well.
So were you making appellate arguments?
I
and
was
working on
making
briefs?
appellate arguments right off the bat, and the nice thing, and I tell people now, the wonderful thing about government work is that it's so non-hierarchical. So I walk in and I get an argument in the Sixth Circuit, picking up on someone who had done the brief and left, in far less time than it would take the ordinary associate to get his or her first deposition. And it was wonderful because I was too young to know that I was supposed to be afraid.
In a way, it was trial by fire.
It was trial by
But
fire.
you didn't know you were
I
in the
didn't
fire.
know that at the time.
And so then you went to the EOC after that. How did you find working for a government agency?
Well, remember when I went, the Title VII was still defining the limits of liability under Title VII, and we were pushing the limits on gender discrimination issues in the pension benefits sector. So we had the defined benefits plans and the defined contribution plans and gender segregated actuarial tables, and we were doing those on the front end. And we had also just recently obtained jurisdiction from the Department of Labor over the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. So we were looking at issues like the mandatory retirement age for police officers and firemen, and it was a fascinating time to be at the agency.
Really there during some of the most exciting work.
I thought so. I enjoyed it very much.
And what did you do after that?
Well, as is unfortunately likely to be the case in government, you sooner or later get promoted away from what you enjoy and what you are good at, what you think you are good at, into supervisory positions. So I became acting associate legal counsel and then functioned, I think I was executive assistant to then Chairman Clarence Thomas, who had come to the agency and was looking for in-agency expertise, so he asked me to be on his staff. And then I served as acting legal counsel. So I was there for about 10 years, and only about 3 or 4 of those were in appellate, and the others were in supervisory or special assistant roles.
And what did you do after the EOC work?
I'm an only child. My parents were aging, and my mother had muscular dystrophy, and her mobility was continuing to decline. So I came home, and I became a professor at North Carolina Central University School of Law. And I remember the first year I taught property and appellate advocacy, and I think I may have been relearning property about a month, 2 to 4 weeks ahead of the students.
So I know at some point you went on the North Carolina Utilities Commission.
I did, but remember I served on the North Carolina Court of Appeals first, and then ran to keep that seat and lost to my now colleague and good friend, Judge Wynn, and
Okay.
we still laugh about that. And then Governor Martin appointed me to the Utilities Commission, which was also enjoyable because at the time we were starting to look at electric utility restructuring, the deregulation in the generation sector, the Telecommunications Act of 1984, and opening up the local loop to competition. So it was an exciting time to be there as well.
I want to go back to that year you spent on the Court of Appeals, and at the time, to stay on the court, you had to engage in a statewide election.
That's
is that
right.
And as you say, your opponent was your now very good friend, Jim Wynn. Just comment on that a little bit. It was a different time, wasn't it, for judicial elections?
When I look at, I don't think, well, I raised, the amount of money I raised doesn't even qualify as negligible anymore. You know, I would get donations of $20 and I would write little thank you notes because my mother didn't think that, she always said you had to write a thank you note. I remember writing a thank you note for $5 and complaining to her that it was more expensive for me to write the thank you note than the amount of the contribution, and she reminded me it's not the amount, it's the gesture. So I can't even fathom, I can't get my mind around the amounts of money people have to raise now to run for office.
It's a very different time. Well, now then, while you were on the Utilities Commission, you remained active in bar association matters. Is that right?
That's right. How do you say no to Rhoda Billings?
That's all of us have had that problem. And eventually, you became president of the North Carolina Bar Association.
Eventually, I did. And it was, I credit the Bar Association with giving me the opportunity to meet people I otherwise never would have gotten to know. I feel very blessed in that regard.
And that answers the question I was going to ask, which is, what influence has the Bar Association had on your career?
It gave me leadership experience because I think it may have been the first time I've led an organization of that breadth and level of membership. And that was fun. And it occurred at a time, the anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, which gave me a chance to explore the impact that the law has had on the lives of African Americans and others. So it dovetailed very nicely with a lot of the things I witnessed and experienced when I was growing up and watching the African American law students at North Carolina Central and the battles that they were facing.
You know, as I recall, that Brown versus Board of Education celebration, it was the 50th anniversary, and you presided over an event that included not only lawyers from all over the state, but people from all over the country who were heavily involved in the civil rights movement.
It was just wonderful. People who, well, of course, John Hope Franklin, who is next door, and please remind me of the name of Jack Greenberg. Jack Greenberg, yes, who came from New York and participated. I have to tell you one anecdote about that. Of course, we had no trouble whatsoever getting someone to represent Brown. That was not the problem. But getting someone to represent the Board of Education was a challenge. So I tried to woo my former law professor, Walter Dellinger, with the thought, well, think of how much fun it could be, no bites. But a young woman who was a law professor at Wake Forest took it on and did a magnificent job with what had to be an emotionally challenging now argument. And it was a wonderful argument, and her point was largely, the law should not lead society. The law should follow society. And it was excellent, but there was this one particularly memorable line. She said, well, if you do this for African Americans, then you'll have to do it for women, and then you'll have to do it for handicapped people, and where will it all end?
And I recall she was very good.
She was exceptional.
Yeah, she was terrific. Well, somewhere along in there, while you were serving as president of the North Carolina Bar Association, you got nominated for the Fourth Circuit.
While I was president-elect, I got
Yes.
nominated, and there was some consternation, but a past president assured the other past presidents that it would pose no problem because the process would take at least until I completed my past president year.
But,
But-
contrary to that comment, you were confirmed quite quickly and unanimously, as I recall.
The nomination went to the Senate just before I was to be sworn in as president at the Asheville meeting the next year.
Yeah, and that was pretty extraordinary given years of delay in appointments and confirmations, I should say, to that court and to the district courts in North Carolina over the years. I mean, that was fast.
It was quite extraordinary. In fact, I remember telling a friend of mine at the law firm, what was then Kilpatrick Stockton and is now Kilpatrick Townsend, that I was the latest in a long line of sacrificial lambs.
But you turned out to be the main
But I
course
turned
because
out,
you got confirmed.
it turned out not to be the case. And the timing was fortuitous in a way because I got the call from the White House about my nomination hearing the following week when I was driving to Asheville for the Bar Association meeting. And they told me that they would send me some boxes of material to prepare for the confirmation hearing. And I had planned to turn to those as soon as I got back from the Bar Association meeting Sunday night, I think it was. And I came home and there were about 5 banker's boxes of materials confronting me to read. And I opened the first one, and it was a part of the hearing, of one of the hearings on Miguel Estrada. And so someone who had had a very bumpy and unsuccessful nomination process. So I put the top back on the box, pushed them all aside, and said, I'm going to have to wing this one.
Which you did beautifully.
Well, I did, to be fair, get 6 minutes of questioning, and the first question was a friendly question, which threw me, because I was looking for the hidden agenda. Finally decided, no, I guess there really wasn't one, and answering it as presented.
Well, much like the judicial campaign you engaged in before, the vote to confirm you was 93-0. It was unanimous. It's a very different time now, isn't it?
It's a very different time, and I regret that on behalf of my colleagues and those who aspire to the bench and those who are considered for the bench. I suspect that call from the White House is not greeted with the same level of unalloyed enthusiasm that it might have been in some other time.
Now let's talk about, since you've been on the Fourth Circuit, Chief Justice Roberts has gotten you involved in quite a number of, let's call them outside ventures,
Yes.
other than writing opinions and hearing appellate arguments. Tell us about that.
At my request, one could say beseeching and begging and pleading, he appointed me to the International Judicial Relations Committee of the United States Judicial Conference. The IJRC came into being after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR. And the United States began to be bombarded with requests from Soviet countries for training and information about the United States judiciary and its accompanying structure. And so the IJRC was created to field requests that were beginning to come in from those countries, but it has since expanded, and we have been and had contact with judiciaries and governments from almost 200 countries around the world. It is amazing. I think last year I was I was in Asia and Australia on several different occasions, different trips, meeting with one-on-one with my counterpart judges, and it has been, I hesitate to say, I know that it is, they tell me that it is a learning experience for them, but it is certainly no less a learning experience for me. I learn, I suspect, at least as much as I impart knowledge.
Talk about that a little bit, because you're in the process of talking with judges from other countries about our legal system and how we bring justice and treat people equally and be fair to them, how we create a system in which that can happen. How is it that you learned something from that process?
I have learned to be very grateful and very humble that I do not face the challenges that some of my colleagues around the world face when they are attempting to do their jobs. I have Pakistani justices who are driven to work in armored tanks. They have had to withdraw their children from school, and their offices and chambers are routinely swept for bombs because of the threats that they receive simply because they are trying to do their job fairly and administer justice fairly and adhere to the principles of rule of law. So it makes me very cautious about complaining about anything in my circumstances because we are, by comparison, we are relatively privileged. I have gotten to know judges in Myanmar, for example, and think of what they must face in the circumstances when you have a very strong military presence there, you have a very decentralized government, limited power, central government, you have conflict on your borders, and yet they try to do the best they can under just mind-boggling circumstances and very little pay and relatively little recognition.
Do you feel like the contact you've had with these other countries and the judges from these other countries has given you a different perspective in your work on the court?
Less so my work on the court, but I think my outlook on my role as a judge. Although, as a judge, I think I've always been fairly open to the likelihood that I am wrong. I have been wrong often enough to not find it to be a particularly troubling experience. It does not bother me to acknowledge that I've learned since yesterday, and I do like the 3-judge panel for that reason. I get to benefit from the perspectives of judges who see things very differently from me, although I respect their views. And the fact that we do it so collegially is something that I like and something that I understand is not the case on all circuits. And in fact, my law clerks have talked about, every year they'll say something to the effect of, well, our going to Richmond is like old home week. We're all hugging and glad to see each other. So I think that's very nice. But I live in a relatively safe and secure environment. There are the occasional death threats, but it's not a daily part of my life that some of my colleagues have to face in other countries.
And it sounds as if, at least in the Fourth Circuit, debate and disagreement can occur with respect.
With respect and collegiality, and in some instances, just affection. I have a colleague I will occasionally say to, well, let's just settle this by arm wrestling. And he always demurs because he said, that's a no-win for me. I'm supposed to win, but you probably will. And what will that look like?
Yeah. Well, let's turn now for a moment and talk about some personal things. I know that there are a number of things that you do outside your court work that keep you sane. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about those things.
As you might have gleaned from my chambers, I love flowers in general, orchids in particular. And I do think I have started taking some with me to Richmond just for the week that I'm going to be there. And I was telling Chief Judge Gregory about it. He came to my chambers once to talk about, we were talking about something court-related, and he said, you bring these orchids up just for the week? And I said, yes, because I'm reading a capital case, and I'll put it down, I'll take a breath, and I'll look up and I'll see something beautiful. And it will fortify me to go back and deal with some of the horror that we see in the cases that come before us.
And you've been involved in gardening and flowering and all of that for a number of years.
Yes.
Don't you have an orchid named for you now?
I do have an orchid
That's
named
pretty
for me.
impressive.
I think so too. And in fact, I don't understand why it's not the first thing people say about me when they're introducing me. And in fact, I'll get rather hostile when someone is reading this introduction and they'll say, well, she's on the Fourth Circuit and she's done this. And I'll say, wait a minute, you've missed the only interesting part. I have an orchid named after me, for heaven's sake.
That would be by the Royal
Horticultural Society in London, yes.
That
It
is
a
very,
Catholic.
very
Well,
impressive, I
thank
have to
you.
say.
Thank you for recognizing the significance of that.
Well, tell me, you also have had many dogs over the years. I know you currently have
A rescue.
yes. Tell us about your dogs.
The dog, I've been very active in greyhound rescue, and in fact was briefly involved in greyhound underground. You serve as a way station for rescued greyhounds coming up from racetracks in Florida en route to homes. I only have one at the moment. She's an only child, and she likes that. She rules the roost. And they are a huge part of my life. I am known among my friends as a dog whisperer, and even by President Obama, who commented on how much more attention I was paying to his dog than I was to him during a brief conversation when I had the honor of meeting him as president of the Federal Judges Association.
Now, I believe you said that there was a later visit with President Obama, and he did not bring Bo to
He
that
did
meeting.
not
Is that
bring
right?
Bo, and in fact, when I met him, I was about to introduce myself because surely he could not remember me. And he said, the dog is not here this time. So clearly he did remember me, and not particularly favorably either.
No competition
No
from Bo
competition
on that
from
occasion.
Bo.
That's funny. Well, you mentioned earlier John Hope Franklin. You must have known him
Forever.
growing up.
I knew him, and I didn't realize I knew her before she was, I knew John Hope Franklin before he was the John Hope Franklin. He was just someone my parents knew. And so I've known him all my life. And he's the person who introduced me to orchids. He was a very important part of the Brown versus Board of Education panel program that we had, an oral re-argument. And
He was an extraordinary man, a man of history, a man of vision, very thoughtful, and you must have been influenced by him.
I was influenced by his courtliness, his courtesy, his unfailing sense of humor. When I took the Fourth Circuit to sit at North Carolina Central for the first time, we had never sat at Central, and so I invited. I think that was the time that Judge Gregory came and Judge Wilkinson came, and there was a dinner at our house, and I invited John Hope Franklin because I wanted him to meet Judge Wilkinson because they're both lovers of history, and I think this is something that needs to happen. And it was so lovely to see them engage as historians, one a professional, Jay as someone who was very interested. But at one point, Judge Wilkinson asked him, John Hope was explaining all the research he was doing for his autobiography, and Judge Wilkinson said, why are you doing all of this research to write about yourself? And John Hope drew himself up and looked at Judge Wilkinson and said, I'm writing an autobiography, not a memoir.
I love that. Growing up in Durham when you did, it just must have been an extraordinary time in that city.
Durham is extraordinary, and I think one of the roles that I have on the Board of Trustees at Duke is to remind people that Durham is not a colony. You know, Durham had a vibrant history, a remarkably vibrant and productive African American community that we had a hospital, we had a university, we had life insurance companies, we had a life insurance savings and loan, that we had a movie theater, that we had a life insurance company which was the largest African American owned business in the country until Motown. It frustrates me a little when people forget that. So I'm a poster child, I think, for the Durham that I knew, peopled by extraordinary people ahead of their time.
And from what you've said, you clearly were very grounded, if you will, in that history and influenced by the people that you grew up with.
Influenced by and unaware of it. I mean, Leroy Walker, who was the first African American head of the International Olympics Committee, Elna Spalding, who founded Women in Action, one of the gentleman who was the first African American licensed CPA. There were just some remarkable people in that community, and yet, as was the case with John Hope Franklin, I took them all as givens, and I didn't recognize how truly remarkable they were until I left.
Well, and we're all benefiting now, though, from their influence on you.
Well, and their influence on America. Mirrors on America, as John Hope would say.
You know, I saw a quote by a comment that John Hope Franklin made. We must go beyond textbooks, go out into the bypaths and untrodden depths of the wilderness and travel and explore and tell the world the glories of our journey. And when I read that, I thought about you and all of your work, particularly in the international arena, because that's what you're doing now in many respects.
And I hope that, as did John Hope, I find the experience not embittering, but enlightening and empowering and reaffirming. He lived through times that I will never know. In Oklahoma, for instance, and all of the rioting and the displacement that occurred there.
And that's where he grew up.
That's where he grew up.
And his father was a lawyer.
His father was a lawyer, and I always teased him about neglecting his duty to follow in the legal profession. But he was never bitter. He took all he learned and used it to educate others. And may we all be that insightful and magnanimous.
You know, the award you're getting from the Chief Justice's Professionalism Committee has a variety of criteria. And one of the criteria said that the recipient of the award should acknowledge the good that can be accomplished by lawyers who have applied intellectual honesty, compassion, and practical skills in the practice of law. And certainly all three of those things apply to you. Would you comment on what professionalism means to you?
Professionalism means aspiring to the highest aspirations of the profession, to work as hard as we can for the good of our clients, to attempt to elevate the standards of the profession, and to treat everyone with whom we come in contact with dignity and respect. And I think John Hope did that in his profession. The lawyers that I admire, Don Cowan, you, and others have done that, and that's what I hope to do. I would say one thing. I appreciate this award very much. I often feel that I am done far too much credit, and that a large part of any success I have enjoyed has been the result of serendipity. I've been places and people have reached out and helped me for no reason or no apparent reason. And the only thing that I can do is try to do that for the clerks who come my way. And I think that to a large extent, they appreciate it. They may not like me meddling in their affairs and offering opinions on their girlfriends from time to time. But they are my nieces and nephews, and I try to keep up with them. I have an attorney work product board with all their pictures and their offspring.
You always show me pictures of the babies.
Of
There
the
are always more
babies.
babies.
It's a very prolific demographic, and that too is professionalism. Paying it forward is also professionalism.